All right, welcome while we read about Worcester v. Georgia. I know it's weird, but that's pronounced Worcester. It was about how states cannot regulate natives, the Native Americans. This is a Supreme Court decision, March 23rd, 1832. The decision in Worcester v. Georgia was that the states did not have the right to impose regulations on Native American land. President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the ruling, removing the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears instead. So this is a Supreme Court case trying to avoid the Trail of Tears before it happened, and Jackson just simply didn't listen to it. White Christian missionaries, including Samuel A. Worcester, see him up there in the little picture, who were living in Cherokee territory in Georgia. The men were advising the Cherokee on how to resist Georgia's attempts to impose state laws on the Cherokee Nation, which was a self-governing nation whose independence and rights to its land had been guaranteed in previous treaties with the United States federal government. To stop the missionaries, Georgia passed an act in 1830 that forbade any white people from living on Cherokee lands unless they obtained a license from Georgia and they swore an oath of loyalty to the state. Basically, Georgia was saying, unless you agree with us, we're not going to let you go talk to the natives because we don't want you teaching them how to beat us at our own game in the court of law. Worcester and other missionaries had been invited by the federal government, the U.S. federal government. So Georgia said you can't go, but the U.S. government invited them to go. They didn't have a Georgian license, and they did not swear an oath of loyalty to Georgia. Worcester and the other missionaries were convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison in 1831. Worcester appealed to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that Georgia had no right to extend its laws to Cherokee land. He said that the act he was convicted under violated the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause. Remember, the Commerce Clause is where the U.S. government, they get to regulate any trade that crosses state borders. The Constitution also bars or prevents the states from passing laws that alter the obligations of contracts, in this case, treaties. Several treaties between the Cherokee and the U.S. federal government recognize the Cherokee Nation. Also, Worcester argued that Georgia laws violated an 1802 Act of Congress that regulated trade and relations between the United States and the American Indian tribes. The Supreme Court agreed with Worcester, ruling that all Georgia laws regarding the Cherokee Nation were unconstitutional. Chief Justice, the guy in charge of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, in his words, he concluded, "The Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct community occupying its own territory, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force, and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter but with the assent of the Cherokees themselves, or in conformity with treaties and with the acts of Congress. The whole intercourse between the United States and this nation is, by our Constitution and laws, vested in the government of the United States," meaning you either have to work with the Cherokees or you have to have permission of the U.S. federal government. The Georgia government doesn't get a say at all. Georgia, however, ignored the decision, kind of like the president, Andrew Jackson, keeping Worcester and other missionaries in prison. Eventually, they were granted a pardon and they were released in 1833. President Jackson had refused to enforce the Supreme Court's decision, which is the entire job of the president is to enforce that which Congress or the Supreme Court says, thus allowing states to enact further legislation damaging to the tribes. This is why it's dangerous when a president doesn't do what they're supposed to do. The U.S. federal government began forcing the Cherokee off their land in 1838. In what became known as the Trail of Tears, some 15,000 Cherokee were driven off from their land and were marched westward on a grueling journey that caused the death of some 4,000 of said Cherokee. One of the unsaid things is that because the Cherokee were one of the 5 civilized tribes, they also had African slaves. If 4,000 of the Cherokee died on this, can you imagine how miserable it was for the Cherokee's slaves? I hope you're learning, and I hope you're having fun.